When you think about it, there are two ways in which we can use the word reckoning. We can use it quite straightforwardly in the sense of counting up, measuring something, giving something its true measure, to reckon. But we can also use it in the sense of things working out in ways that restore the balance, that bring justice, so that something or someone gets its just deserts, a moment of reckoning when things work out as we think they should do. The passage we're going to hear from Matthew is a story of reckoning in both of those ways. They're related ways, but different. One of them, I think, is central to the meaning and significance of the gospel story, and the other, I think, is incidental and maybe a bit of a distraction. So listen out for those two senses of reckoning and see if you can distinguish between them. This is Matthew chapter 18, starting at verse 23. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him, and as he could not pay, his lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything." And out of pity for him, the lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him by the throat, he said, "Pay what you owe." Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you." But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed. And they went and reported to their lord all that had taken place. Then his lord summoned him and said to him, "You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you?" And in anger, his lord handed him over to be tortured until he should pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart. So it's certainly a story of reckoning, isn't it, for that slave who, having been forgiven a massive debt by his lord, then fails to forgive even a trivial debt by one of his fellow slaves. He gets his comeuppance and justice is done. But I think it's also a story of reckoning in that other sense, and it's that other sense that I think is the crucial one and the one that speaks of the gospel in this passage. Reckoning in the sense of getting the true measure of something or someone. But what this story is about is that sense of what I would call gospel reckoning, when we set our own human experience, our own human abilities, our love, our personalities, and what we're able to do in relationship with each other, alongside God's love and relationship to us. And we see how utterly different they are in proportion. We get the true measure of where we stand. And because that's where we stand before God, then we know alongside one another, we stand as one in need of God's forgiveness constantly and continually. That sense of gospel reckoning, of realizing who and what we are before God as children in need of God's grace. This story is not a million miles away, of course, from that very familiar phrase from the Lord's Prayer, with which we'll be so familiar. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. It'd be very easy to see that almost like a pulley, that as we pull one side and we make our forgiveness, then God will in equal measure give us our just deserts and give us a little bit of forgiveness in return. That would be quite a wrong way to understand that prayer, and I'm sure none of us do. But that will be a kind of reckoning in that second sense, getting our just deserts, our reward for being forgiving people, that we are ourselves forgiven. I've never understood the prayer in that way, but in that other sense of reckoning, that first sense of reckoning, of seeing where we stand before God as people who are forgiven by his grace and mercy, and therefore we have no option but to respond by being forgiven one for another, because we get the true measure of who we are and how small we are before God. So I think this story leaves me with two challenges. The first is that we are sometimes rather too good at that reckoning, in a sense of trying to see things through to their just deserts, trying to measure ourselves together against other people, trying to work out who is deserving and who is undeserving of our love and of other people's love. We have rather too good an eye sometimes in a cutthroat world to reckon in that way. Alongside that, the challenge to think of that time when we've had a sense of that gospel reckoning, of having truly in our hearts that sense of our true measure before God, where we really stand before God and alongside one another in need of God's grace and God's love and God's mercy. And I think it is that kind of reckoning that opens the door to the kingdom in our world and in our experience.